Breathing and exchange of gases. As you have read earlier, oxygen is utilized by organisms to indirectly break down simple molecules like glucose, amino acid, fatty acid, etc. to derive energy to perform various activities. Carbon dioxide, which is harmful, is also released during the above catabolic reaction. It is therefore evident that oxygen has to be continuously provided to the cells and CO2 produced by the cells have to be released out. This process of exchange of oxygen from atmosphere and CO2 produced by the cell is called breathing, commonly known as respiration. Place your hand on your chest. You can feel the chest moving up and down. You know it is due to breathing. How do we breathe? The respiratory organ and mechanism of breathing are described in the following section of this chapter. Respiratory organs. Mechanism of breathing vary among different groups of animals depending mainly on their habitats and level of organization. Lower invertebrates like sponges, coelentrates, flatworms, etc. exchange O2 with CO2 by simple diffusion over their entire body surface. Earthworms use their moist cuticle and insects have network of tubes, tracheal tubes to transport atmospheric air within the body. A special vascularized structure called gills, branchial respiration are used by most of the aquatic arthropods and mollusks, whereas vascularized bags called lungs, pulmonary respiration are used by terrestrial forms for the exchange of gases. Among vertebrates, fishes use gills whereas amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals respire through lungs. Amphibians like frog can respire through their moist skin also, that is cutaneous respiration. Human respiratory system. We have a pair of external nostrils opening out above the upper lips. It leads to a nasal chamber through a nasal passage. The nasal chamber open into a pharynx, a portion of which is a common passage for food and air. The pharynx open through the larynx region into the trachea. Larynx is a cartilaginous box which helps in sound production, hence called sound box. During swallowing, glottis can be covered by thin elastic cartilaginous flap called epiglottis to prevent the entry of food into the larynx. Trachea is a straight tube extending up to the mid-thoracic cavity, which divides at the level of fifth thoracic vertebra into a right and left primary bronchi. Each bronchi undergoes repeated division to form secondary and tertiary bronchi and bronchioles, ending up in very thin terminal bronchioles. The trachea, primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi and initial bronchioles are supported by incomplete cartilaginous ring. Each terminal bronchioles give rise to a number of very thin, irregular, walled, and vascularized bag-like structure called alveoli. The branching network of bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli comprise the lungs. We have two lungs, which is covered by double-layer pleura with pleural fluid between them. It reduces friction on the lung surface. The outer pleural membrane is in close contact with thoracic lining whereas the inner pleural membrane is in contact with lung surface. The part starting with the external nostril up to the terminal bronchioles constitute the conducting part, whereas the alveoli and their ducts form the respiratory or exchange part of the respiratory system. The conducting part transport the atmospheric air to the alveoli, clear it from foreign particles, humidify it, and also bring the air to body temperature. Exchange part is the site of actual diffusion of O2 and CO2 between blood and atmospheric air. The lungs is situated in the thoracic chamber, which is anatomically an airtight chamber. The thoracic chamber is formed dorsally by the vertebral column, ventrally by the sternum, laterally by the ribs, and on the lower side by dome-shaped diaphragm. The anatomical setup of lungs in the thorax is such that any change in the volume of thoracic cavity will be reflected to the lungs, that is pulmonary cavity. Such an arrangement is essential for breathing as we cannot directly alter the pulmonary volume. Respiration involves following a step: breathing or pulmonary ventilation by which atmospheric air is drawn in and CO2-rich alveolar air is released out. Diffusion of gases O2 and CO2 across alveolar membrane, transport of gases by the blood, diffusion of O2 and CO2 between blood and tissue, utilization of oxygen by the cells for catabolic reaction and resultant release of CO2. Cellular respiration as dealt in chapter 14, the respiration in plants. 17.2 Mechanism of breathing. Breathing involves two steps: inspiration, during which atmospheric air is drawn in, and expiration, by which alveolar air is released out. The movement of air into and out of the lungs is carried out by creating a pressure gradient between the lungs and the atmosphere. Inspiration can occur if the pressure within the lungs, that is intrapulmonary pressure, is less than the atmospheric pressure, that is negative pressure in the lungs with respect to atmospheric pressure. Similarly, expiration takes place when the intrapulmonary pressure is higher than atmospheric pressure. The diaphragm, an specialized set of muscle external and internal intercostal between the ribs, help in generation of such gradients. Inspiration is initiated by contraction of diaphragm. Initiated by the contraction of diaphragm, which increases the volume of thoracic cavity in the anterior-posterior axis. The contraction of external intercostal muscle lift of the ribs and sternum, causing an increase in volume of the thoracic chamber in the dorsoventral axis. The overall increase in the thoracic volume causes similar increase in pulmonary volume. An increase in pulmonary volume decreases the interpulmonary pressure to less than the atmospheric pressure, which forces the air from outside to move into the lungs. That is inspiration. The relaxation of the diaphragm and the intercostal muscle return the diaphragm and sternum to their normal or original position, and reduce the thoracic volume and thereby the pulmonary volume. This leads to an increase in interpulmonary pressure to slightly above the atmospheric pressure, causing an expulsion of air from the lungs, that is expiration. We have the ability to increase the strength of inspiration and expiration with the help of additional muscle in the abdomen. On an average, a healthy human breathes 12 to 16 times per minute. The volume of air involved in breathing movement can be estimated by using a spirometer, which helps in clinical assessment of pulmonary function. Here is a figure showing inspiration, diaphragm contracted, ribs and sternum raised up, volume of thorax increases. Here is a diagram showing expiration, diaphragm relaxed and arched upward, ribs and sternum return to original position, volume of thorax decreases, air expelled from lungs. Respiratory volume and capacity. Tidal volume. Volume of air inspired and expired during normal respiration. It approx 500 milliliter. That is, a healthy man can inspire or expire approximately 6,000 to 8,000 milliliter of air per minute. Inspiratory reserve volume (IRV). Additional volume of air a person can inspire by forceful inspiration. It averages 2,500 to 3,000 milliliter. Expiratory reserve volume, additional volume of air a person can expire by forceful expiration. This averages 1000 to 1100 milliliter. Residual volume RV, volume of air remaining in the lungs even after forceful expiration. This averages 1100 to 1200 milliliter. By adding a few respiratory volume described above, one can derive various pulmonary capacities which can be used in clinical diagnosis. Inspiratory capacity IC, volume of total inspiratory capacity IC, total volume of air a person can inspire after a normal expiration. This include tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. Tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. Expiratory capacity EC, total volume of air a person can expire after normal inspiration. This includes tidal volume and expiratory reserve volume. Functional residual capacity FRC, volume of air that will remain in lungs after normal expiration. This includes expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. Vital capacity, a maximum volume of air a person can breathe in after forced expiration. This includes expiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve volume, or the maximum volume of air a person can breathe out after of forced inspiration. Total lungs capacity, total volume of air accommodated in the lungs at the end of forced inspiration. This includes residual volume, inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and inspiratory reserve volume, or vital capacity plus residual volume. Exchange of gases. Alveoli are the primary site of exchange of gases. Exchange of gases also occur between blood and tissue. O2 and CO2 are exchanged at this site by simple diffusion, mainly based on pressure or concentration gradient. Solubility of gases as well as thickness of membrane involvement. Diffusion are are some important factors that can affect the rate of diffusion. Pressure contributed by individual gas in the mixture of gases is called partial pressure, and it is represented by PO2 for oxygen and PCO2 for carbon dioxide. Partial pressure of these two gases in the atmospheric air and two sides of diffusion are given in table 17.1 and in figure 17.3. The data given in the table clearly indicate a concentration gradient for oxygen from alveoli to blood and blood to tissue. Similarly, a gradient is present for CO2 in opposite direction, that is from tissue to blood and blood to alveoli. As the solubility of CO2 is 20 to 25 times higher than that of oxygen, the amount of CO2 that can diffuse through the diffusion membrane per unit difference in partial pressure is much higher compared to that of O2. The diffusion membrane is made up of three major layers, namely the thin squamous epithelium of alveoli, endothelium of alveolar capillary, and the basement substance, composed of thin basement membrane supporting the squamous epithelium and the basement membrane surrounding the single layer endothelial cells of capillary in between them. However, its total thickness is much less than a millimeter. Therefore, all the factors in our body are favorable for diffusion of O2 from alveoli to tissue and that of CO2 from tissue to alveoli. Here is a here is a chart. Respiratory gases, oxygen and CO2 atmospheric air uh, pressure in millimeter of Hg. 159.3 alveoli में 104-40, डीऑक्सीजनेटेड ब्लड में 40-45, ऑक्सीजनेटेड ब्लड में 95-40, टिश्यू में 40-45, सिमिलर टू दैट सेम एज दैट ऑफ deoxygenated blood. Transport of gases. Blood is the medium of transport of O2 and CO2. About 97% of O2 is transported by RBC in the blood. The remaining 3% of O2 is carried in a dissolved state through the plasma. Nearly 20 to 25% of the CO2 is transported by RBC, whereas 70% of it is carried as bicarbonate. About 7% of the CO2 is carried in dissolved state through plasma. Transport of oxygen. Hemoglobin is a red color iron containing pigment present in RBC. O2 can bind with hemoglobin in a reversible manner to form oxyhemoglobin. Each hemoglobin molecule can carry a maximum of 4 molecules of oxygen. Binding of oxygen with hemoglobin is primarily related to partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of CO2, hydrogen ion concentration, and temperature are the other factors which can interfere with this binding. A sigmoid curve is obtained when percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen is plotted against partial pressure of O2. This curve is called oxygen dissociation curve and is highly useful in studying the effect of factors like partial pressure of CO2, hydrogen ion concentration, etc. on binding of oxygen with hemoglobin. In the alveoli, where there is high partial pressure of O2, low partial pressure of CO2, lesser hydrogen ion concentration, and lower temperature, the factors are all favorable for the formation of oxyhemoglobin. Whereas in the tissue, where low partial pressure of O2 and high partial pressure of CO2, high hydrogen ion concentration, and higher temperature exist, the conditions are favorable for dissociation of oxygen from oxyhemoglobin. This clearly indicates that oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin in the lung surface and get dissociated at the tissue. Every 100 milliliter of oxygenated blood can deliver about 5 milliliter of O2 to the tissue under normal physiological condition. Transport of carbon dioxide. CO2 is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin, about 20 to 25%. This binding is related to partial pressure of CO2. PO2 is the major factor which could affect this binding. When partial pressure of CO2 is high and PO2 is low, as in the tissues where more binding of carbon dioxide occur, whereas when the PCO2 is low and PO2 is high, as in the alveoli, dissociation of carbon dioxide from carbaminohemoglobin takes place. That is CO2 which is bound to hemoglobin from the tissue is delivered at the alveoli. RBC contain a very high concentration of enzyme carbonic anhydrase and a minute quantity of the same is present in plasma too. This enzyme facilitates the following reaction in both directions. CO2 plus water in the presence of carbonic anhydrase form carbonic acid, which in the presence of carbonic anhydrase further forms bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. At the tissue site where Partial pressure of CO2 is high due to catabolism. CO2 diffuses into blood, RBC and plasma and form bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. At, at the alveolar side where pCO2 is low, and the reaction proceeds in the opposite direction leading to the formation of CO2 and water. Thus, CO2 trapped at bicarbonate at the tissue level and transported to the alveoli and released out as CO2. Every 100 milliliter of deoxygenated blood deliver approximately 4 milliliter of CO2 to the alveoli. One important data in the absence of enzyme carbonic anhydrase, the number of carbonic acid formed is 200 molecule per hour, but in the presence 6 lakhs molecules forms per second, which increases the rate by about 10 million times given in biomolecules chapter. This is also important. Uh, Carbon monoxide binds with hemoglobin during cigarette smoking forms carboxyhemoglobin, which is a stable compound. Regulation of respiration. Human being has a significant ability to maintain and moderate the respiratory rhythm to suit the demands of the body tissue. It is done by neural system, a specialized center present in the medulla region of the brain called respiratory rhythm center is primarily responsible for this regulation. Another center present in the pons region of the brain called pneumotaxic center can moderate the function of respiratory rhythm center. Neural signal from this center can reduce the duration of inspiration and thereby alter the respiratory rate. A chemosensitive area situated adjacent to rhythm center, which is highly sensitive to CO2 and hydrogen ion, increase in these substances can activate this center, which in turn can signal the respiratory center to make necessary adjustment in the respiratory process by which these substances can be eliminated. The receptor associated with aortic arc and carotid artery also can recognize changes in CO2 and hydrogen ion concentrations and send necessary signal to the respiratory center for remedial action. The role of oxygen in the regulation of respiratory rhythm is quite insignificant. Disorder of respiratory system. Asthma is difficulty in breathing caused wheezing due to inflammation of bronchi and bronchioles. Emphysema is a chronic disorder in which alveolar valves are damaged, due to which respiratory surface is decreased. One of the major cause of this is cigarette smoking. Occupational respiratory disorder. In certain industry, especially those involving grinding or stone breaking, so much dust is produced that the defense mechanism of body cannot fully cope with the situation. Long exposure can give rise to inflammation, leading to fibrosis, proliferation of the fibrous tissue, and thus causing serious lung damage. Workers in such industries should wear protective masks. Summary. Cells utilize oxygen for metabolism and produce energy along with substances like carbon dioxide, which is harmful. Animals have evolved different mechanisms for transport of oxygen to the cell and the removal of carbon dioxide from there. We have a well-developed respiratory system comprising two lungs and associated air passes to perform this function. The first step in the respiration is breathing, by which atmospheric air is taken in inspiration and alveolar air is released out. Expiration, exchange of O2 and CO2 between deoxygenated blood and alveoli. A transport of these gases through the blood, throughout the body by blood exchange of O2 and CO2 between oxygenated blood and tissue, and utilization of O2 by the cellular respiration are the other steps involved. Inspiration and expiration are carried out by creating pressure gradient between atmospheric air and the alveoli with the help of a specialized muscle, intercostal and diaphragm. Volume of air involved in this activity can be estimated with the help of a spirometer and are of clinical significance. Exchange of O2 and CO2 at alveoli and tissue occur by simple diffusion or diffusion. Rate of diffusion is dependent on partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of CO2, their solubility as well as thickness of diffusion membrane. These factors in our body facilitate diffusion of O2 from alveoli to the deoxygenated blood as well as oxygenated blood to the tissue. The factors are favorable for the diffusion of CO2 in the opposite direction, that is from tissue to alveoli. Oxygen is transported mainly as oxyhemoglobin, about 97%. In the alveoli, where partial pressure of O2 is higher and O2 get bound to hemoglobin, which is easily dissociated at the tissue where PO2 is low and PCO2 hydrogen ion are concentration are high. Nearly 70% of the carbon dioxide is transported as bicarbonate with the help of enzyme carbonic anhydrase. 25% of carbon dioxide is carried by hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. In the tissue where partial pressure of CO2 is high, it get bound to blood, whereas in the alveoli where PCO2 is low and PO2 is high, it get removed from the blood. Respiratory rhythm is maintained by respiratory center in the medulla region of the brain and pneumotaxic center in the pons region in the brain, and a chemosensitive area in the medulla can alter respiratory mechanism. That's all. Thank you.